Welcome back, everybody, to the Creative Coders. I'm so happy you're here. Before we begin with our lesson today, I wanted to remind us all that we are confident, creative, and capable coders, as well as people in general. So people communicate in different languages all the time. Whether you're saying hello, or hola, or assalamu alaikum, you're using a language that has a structure and a set of rules. Python is trying to communicate with our computers at the end of the day. Our computers, however, operate in something interesting called machine code, which looks like a bunch of ones and zeros. So as humans, we can't really compute that with our brains, right? And that's where Python and other high-level programming languages come in. Python, after all, is pretty bilingual. It knows how to translate the code that we write into machine code. And the Python language looks like what we typically see in our own languages, which is why it's so much easier for us to understand than the zeros and the ones in machine code. So let's go back to that structure that I mentioned earlier. All languages have a specific set of structures that govern how we communicate with them. Python is no different. It has something called syntax, and this is the structure of our language. Python is expecting you to communicate with it in certain ways so that it understands what you're trying to tell it. We'll learn more about this in a future lesson, but it's very important for us to use comments throughout our code. Comments are basically us telling ourselves what we were trying to do. But it also is helping people who might look at our code in the future understand our thought process and our approach to coding. Comments begin with a simple hashtag in Python, and anything preceding that hashtag is going to be disregarded. Now, space is especially important in Python. If you're coming from a different language like Java, C++, Python doesn't really require anything to indicate the end to a statement. So we see here that we have a variable called add2. We'll talk about variables in a future lesson, but for now, we can think of them as boxes that are holding values. In the same way that a box can hold any sort of item, a variable can do the same thing. And so here we are assigning that variable to a value, right? And so this value is going to be the sum of 4 plus 5. So we don't see a real ending here, right? If you're coming from something like JavaScript, you might see a semicolon at the end of this and it might look a little bit different. But for Python, we don't really need an ending. Whitespace is also very important in Python in general. Whitespace is going to tell Python the flow of the code. So for instance, let's say we have a simple while loop. The while loop we'll be looking at today is right over here. We come up with this question: what is actually in the while loop? What code are we looping over every single time? Python knows all of the answers to these questions, very interestingly, because of the whitespace before our print statement. The little colon at the end here signifies that we're entering a loop and that anything after this colon is going to be carried out. The main takeaway from this lesson is that Python, like any other language, has a structure or a syntax that it expects you to stick to when you're communicating with it. We'll learn about some more interesting components of this structure in future lessons, but we talked about whitespace and comments as two elements of this syntax in this lesson. If you need to review any of these concepts that we went over today, I've provided this little content breakdown on the side of this screen, so feel free to click through these to reinforce your learning. Thank you so much for tuning into this lesson. Feel free to subscribe and never miss a future video.